Okay, so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining this virtual meeting organized by the Research Network on Public Authorities and Financial Distress. Today, we are very pleased to have with us Bethia Pearson and Rebecca Perry. I will introduce them in a second, and today we'll be speaking of utility companies and special rescue procedures in the UK. Just so you know, the meeting is recorded, so if you don't want it to be recorded, if you don't want your questions to be recorded, please do just let us know and we will remove it later on from the recording. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speakers for today. Bethia Pearson is a researcher with a background in political science and journalism. She earned her PhD from the University of Glasgow, and it was a PhD funded by the ESRC, and it focused on media access for human rights campaigns in Uruguay during democratization. Previously, she worked as a journalist for 16 years at publications including The Herald, and her research with the ERC Global Remunicipalization projects includes trade union campaigns for insourcing in the UK and Robin Hood Energy. Rebecca Perry is Professor of Law at Nottingham Trent University. Her main research interests lie in international and comparative insolvency law. She's interested in the intersection of technology and commercial law, including the regulatory framework needed to support digital economies and the use of artificial intelligence. And she's currently conducting some research on special administration regimes, which will be presented at a seminar organized by the Insolvency Lawyers Association soon, and also here at this meeting today. So we're very, very pleased to have you both here today at this meeting. thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Now, without further ado, I would like to start with some questions, and I would like to start with some questions for Beth. First, your research focuses on remunicipalization, a growing global trend where cities take back privatized assets, infrastructure, and services into public ownership. Could you share insights from your work on the global remunicipalization project, particularly regarding the main drivers behind this trend and the challenges cities face when transitioning back to public ownership?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'll outline a little bit about the nature of our project, which will let you know the kind of data we receive and the kind of research that we're doing that enable us to speak to different points about the processes. But basically, our project has been a 5-year project, largely interrupted by the COVID pandemic, which sort of significantly changed some of the things that we've been researching. But one of the benefits of that was that it really took one of our things, which was the Public Features Database, which is an open source database, which logs cases of municipalization around the world. And this took on a life of its own because of that. It's the only database of deprivatization that exists in the world. It's not perfect, but we're pretty open about our methodology. And it's crowdsourced, so we invite people to submit cases from around the world. They're often working for councils or municipalities, or they're campaigners, and then we verify them before they're published as part of the database. So some of the data I'll talk about today is from that, and we've just received a new set of figures from it as well. So if I refer to a document to do that, I haven't internalized them yet, but we do have them ready. And then beyond that, we do qualitative research into particular cases. So pre-COVID, my assigned case was Argentina, but that was largely abandoned, and now I do the UK and a bit of Spain. I have colleagues who've researched cases in Germany, France, USA, so I can speak to some of those. But that broadly outlines where we're coming from. Currently, the Public Features Database has 1,763 cases in 71 countries in every continent in the world, so we understand the processes of remunicipalization, as we call it, which broadly we're defining as any deprivatization at a subnational level. That accounts for different country contexts, but obviously the internal government arrangements differ very widely, but we wanted to be able to find a way to talk about these as a combined sort of processes. The variety within that is vast, so there's a range of sectors, there's a range of different contexts, there's a range of domestic and regional dynamics that go into all of these. So as such, we tend to be reluctant to generalize about what's going on, But we are confident in saying some things, which is that yes, there has been an increase in these processes since they've started to be logged in the year 2000. That began when there was a big pushback against water privatisation, and the database began as just an initiative that logged these water deprivatisations, but then it expanded to include other sectors as it was noticed by people on the ground, as in social movements, campaigners, that something bigger was happening. So in terms of the drivers, and if you have any questions about sectors, etc., then I'm happy to answer those after, probably directly referring to the new data that we've got. But in terms of the drivers, there's one way of answering this, which is that in the database, we ask people who submit the cases to tell us why this service has been deprivatised. This isn't an absolute measure because this is an optional measure that they can submit. So not everyone who submits a case submits this motivation question, but we do have 957 responses to that question, and of these, the majority response is to increase the quality of service provision. That's more than 400 responses. People can give more than one response for each service, and these aren't disaggregated, so we can't tell how many responses a person has given. That's one issue with our data. But secondary motivations are reducing the provision cost, regaining decision-making power, and achieving policy objectives. So those are the four things that come out by the measure of public futures. In terms of our qualitative research, the research I've done in the UK, there is evidence that councils themselves are publishing their own findings in their reports, that once they insource a service, they have cost savings and an improvement in quality service provision. Now, obviously, this is important because for a long time, privatisation was bound up with the assumption that it reduced costs and that it produced a more effective service. So having evidence of this, not just from trade unions, not just from the Labour Party, not from quarters where we might expect this argument to be made, has been really important. And as we know, although we find it difficult to quantify or even get councils to admit to, councils look to other councils to see what they're doing. So we expect that these reports themselves are probably quite influential. Beyond that, another accelerant, certainly in the UK, that we're seeing is that once trade unions realised that councils had begun to insource services on the quiet. We've called it sort of a stealth insourcing in the UK because it just started happening without anyone really noticing it. But once trade unions did notice that it was happening, they started changing their campaigns around insourcing and realised that that was an opportunity for them to really engage. And since then, we've seen some high-profile insourcing wins by trade unions in healthcare, leisure services, transport, for instance. In terms of drivers in other countries, there's a cluster around sort of wide-scale, regional level initiatives. We see this in Germany with the energy transition projects. There's a huge number of cases associated with that. The same in France with deprivatisation of water services. Beyond that, there's been little clusters in Spain. The radical municipal movement produced some sort of a wave of projects. Not all of them have lasted. That's been one thing that people have had to go away and ask what happened there, but there have been some cases where they have been sustained, such as the remunicipalization of water in Terrassa, which is a really good example of how deprivatisation can work at the local level, but also a case study of how sustaining that is actually very difficult and takes a lot of energy, often by voluntary people as well. Beyond that, we're seeing in Chile, there's a cluster of cases of popular pharmacies where municipalities are setting up their own pharmaceutical supplies. So Chile's obviously a heavily privatised neoliberal society. So we'd interpret that as pushback against neoliberal policies and the way in which they sort of reinforce inequalities. So municipalities are realising how they can kind of intervene in these inequalities. And then the other thing we're starting to see, and this is particularly in the USA, is an increase in public ownership in new sectors. So the driver there is not responding to previous processes of privatisation, but actually actively preventing it by municipalities getting involved in new public services sort of on the front foot, often in cases of broadband and IT. So preventing the sort of capture of those policies before it starts to happen. I think the second part of that question was to do with the challenges that cities face. So I'm not sure how long I've been talking already, but I'll try to answer this quickly. So obviously, privatisation is highly ideologized in various contexts, and this applies pretty much across the board. So the politics of it is a huge challenge. I think in the UK, historically, that's been quite significant because the private versus public ownership debate in the UK has quite tenacious roots in the 1970s and very particular dynamics of what happened there. And whenever something around public ownership happens, those stereotypes seem to come up again as if sort of preserved in aspic, you know, regardless of what decade they're being brought up in, or what sector or what level of ownership's been brought up in. It's always about, you know, the 1970s or Thatcher, and we don't seem to get beyond that. Or acknowledge the fact that councils are moving beyond that, because we know that Labour councils and Conservative councils have been quietly insourcing. But still, it seems like it is an internal argument that councils have to overcome. And that might not be just for political reasons. It's also because procurement officers have a tendency to be risk adverse, and there's perceptions around what constitutes risk, and out with sort of acknowledged frameworks like social value, for instance, where there is more training around different options in procurement, there may be reluctance to pursue that. We're also seeing in councils where more staff moved from the private sector into the public sector around the time of the financial crisis, that certain assumptions have come with that around public ownership, and there is this kind of be a resistance among officers to insource as an option. A critical one in the UK, but we think this is probably quite broad as well, is the loss of capacity that outsourcing brought to councils in the first place. So the capacity in terms of the resources to do things, the services in-house to do them, but also the expertise, and approaching that as an additional obstacle is something else that councils have to deal with. Some things we've noticed have been emerging to help address this. APSI, for instance, have started to produce lots of toolkits and have done lots of consultation work to support councils. The Welsh Government produced an insourcing kit. And then on the other hand, we're seeing the Chartered Institute for Public Finance and Accountancy in 2022 produce its own kit for finance officers working with insourcing. So we know that there has been some movement around addressing that lack of capacity. But we'd also say it represents an opportunity for cities as well to develop capacity in certain ways, to look at rebuilding their governance in certain ways that favours insourcing and as a sustainable option. And we are seeing that in some councils, Suffolk Council, for instance, and I think Hackney as well, have really started addressing this at a fundamental level, rather than doing it on an ad hoc basis for different services. But hopefully that gives some idea of the current landscape.
A lot. Thank you so much. It was very insightful. Thank you, Beth. I wanted to delve into some of your UK research, and particularly on your research on Robin Hood Energy. For those who are not from the UK, Robin Hood Energy was funded by Nottingham City Council to provide affordable energy and tackle fuel poverty, but ultimately failed to turn a profit, accumulating significant losses before its closure. Now, from your perspective, what were the main factors that led to its downfall, and were there specific policy or governance failures that contributed to this outcome?
Sure. So just again to outline the research that this is based on, I conducted 5 interviews with people with very, very senior involvement in Robin Hood Energy. Not all of them agreed to be identified because everyone involved at a certain level had to sign a non-disclosure agreement when it closed. Now, I thought it was worth saying that the way in which people perceived these non-disclosure agreements was interesting, because I interviewed people who signed them and didn't care. They were happy to go on the record, and other people refused to be interviewed because they had an NDA, but I knew the conditions of that didn't include them being interviewed, so I knew that it was being used as an excuse not to talk about it. The other interesting thing was the time lapse. A few interviewees said, you know, if you'd asked me a year ago, I wouldn't have talked to you. But the experience was so stressful in terms of mental health for those involved that they couldn't, that some of them were quite seriously affected by it for a range of reasons, not just because of the public space of it, but there was a lot of internal things happening. So it was just to say that that was one of the things that massively influenced who I was able to speak to. And it does raise questions around the use of NDAs and how are we actually supposed to learn from these things if NDAs are put in place. So I'm aware that the general narrative on the collapse of RHE is that council should have never got involved. It was set up to fail. It was naive to get involved in the first place. And I think that, you know, there are arguments that could be the case, but I think it's also quite easy to forget the context in which this happened. So around 2010, the House of Commons Library produced a memo for MPs on the worrying increase in fuel poverty in the UK at the time. There was a lot of discussion around the increasing cost of energy and the expectation that more of the population was expected to fall into fuel poverty. This was linked to the fact that the big six energy companies were effectively a monopoly of the market, and there was limited opportunity to engage in that and to alter energy policy in a way that helped to address fuel poverty issues. At the same time, the new Tory Lib Dem government at the time were discussing the option of new retail supply firms as a way of opening up the market. That was encouraged by the fact that consumers at the time were starting to use more price comparison websites and were showing more of a willingness to switch, basically, encouraged by money saving expert, etc. So in that sense, a few things were set in place for the atmosphere, should we say, around the energy market was changing a bit, and then we had the real catalyst which was the advancements in software which enabled startup in a box facilities to be offered by private companies. Now these were signed off by Ofgem. They included an Ofgem license, and it meant that new retail suppliers could be walked through the various regulations, things they had to do, funding, etc., and some risk testing by Start in a Box, like Utilibox and other people like this. And by the time they'd reached these processes, the end of the processes, during which a sort of shell company had been set up, and then that would be stress tested, and then it would be handed over to the new retail supplier with the Ofgem license that either would have their energy company. It was designed to fast track new entrants to the energy market at the time. So that was the situation in which RHE set up. So a lot of the signs were that it was, it wasn't that naive. There were a lot of practical support. There was political support in place for this sort of thing to happen. That said, I think we all recognise now that the single greatest obstacle was the nature of the energy market in the UK. Not just the high threshold for entering that, i.e. the level of investment involved initially, but the continuous investment involved to stay in that market and to be competitive against the big six. And we've seen since, obviously, the failure of RHE, almost a regular culling of various other energy startups in the market. That said, there are a few things that probably affected the how and when of what happened with RHE, and this is probably where our research is more useful. The first is around expertise. I think councils are kind of between a rock and a hard place when it comes to specific sectors. And energy sector probably is the most difficult one to enter. The council encountered significant obstacles in attracting and retaining people from the private sector who had the expertise to advise on this. The rock and the hard place was that these people demanded huge salaries, and the council couldn't possibly be seen to pay these salaries, given that other members of the council were on national minimum wage, for instance. So that was a public concern of like how would this look, but it was also an ethical concern, especially because the RHE been set up in the first place to address issues of fuel poverty, etc. Nevertheless, experts come with a price tag attached, which meant that the council kind of employed more middle management expertise rather than other people who might have helped steer the ship a bit differently. Interviewees also talked about cultural factors, that there are certain practices in councils that don't suit specific sectors. So typically councillors would be assigned to work on boards due to their availability rather than their expertise. And the perception was that this often sort of ticks over quite well until you have a situation where there's documents like a risk register that needs to be read and understood, and quite specific questions asked on the basis of that, and whether councillors who've been assigned to that board have the time, expertise, insight necessary to be able to carry out that task. The financial backing was a huge obstacle, not only in terms of the large sums that were required, which were considered normal in the energy sector, but obviously were beyond the pale in the public sector. And the councils just aren't used to the level of investment and risk that's, again, the norm in the energy sector, but not in the public sector. Slow decision making. This is one of the things that hastened the decline of it, because some decisions which to do with payments, to do with the regulator needed to be made, but they couldn't be made because decisions were held up. Whether or not that was for malicious reasons is not clear, and there's different views on that. There were also governance concerns around the role of independent financial consultants. PwC had signed off the business case and was very supportive of it, but obviously when that started to fall apart, there was a sense that that was just ignored, and there were questions raised about, well, are independent financial consultants telling councils what they want rather than a thorough risk assessment. There are also concerns that PwC itself didn't have energy expertise within it either to give a sort of reliable assessment of the risk. So that's kind of a broad list, but that kind of sums up certainly what our interviewees said.
Thanks, Pat. So, I mean, I think that you started answering already the next question that I want to ask you, which is, I mean, on the basis of what happened at Robin Hood Energy, do you think that there are key lessons that local authorities that are considering similar public ventures should consider, and are actually more, I mean, you seem to suggest that, but are there more structural issues in the way that councils operate that may make these initiatives, and particularly the backing by the council of these initiatives, quite unviable or not recommended?
Yeah, so there's a range of things. I guess the first thing to say is that RHE is kind of an anomaly in most council initiatives in this way, and I guess I'm talking in terms of the UK, but we haven't seen many like this internationally. It was thought that it might have quite a severe chilling effect on the readiness of other councils to engage in insourcing processes, but although it's piecemeal, the way that we're seeing UK councils insource different things, there doesn't seem to be that chilling effect, and that's probably because it was a very high risk, high investment, high profile case, and councils are quite rightly saying that insourcing their leisure services is not presenting the same kind of sectoral intervention as Nottingham City Council were. Despite that, there's a few comments I would make based on our research. In terms of the energy projects that have set up since then, I guess Bristol attempted this, and then Plymouth, we had another model where local governments are favouring generation models rather than just retail models. That seems to be one kind of an outcome, but the RHE people, they knew that generation was the key, but what they planned to do was go into that after setting up the retail business. partly because it was a manifesto promise that this retail system would be set up to start addressing fuel poverty. That partly explains the ordering, but also I think there was a degree of lack of planning around what that would actually mean. But I would say that was influenced by the fact that, as I said, new retail entrants were being encouraged at the time, and especially by this sort of retailer in a box. People did say that intermunicipal models would be preferred for higher risk initiatives. The willingness of other councils to get on board with other councils is one of the obstacles to that. But an intermunicipal approach was considered, and other councils did approach Nottingham City Council and got quite close to either collaborating or getting on board with it, but it didn't quite happen. That was also partly to do with perceived profit share. If everything went well, that would also mean sharing the profits. And that's, I guess you have to balance that against the risk. These projects are also often, and I'm speaking more internationally now, set up by what we call a municipal entrepreneur. So there's often one visionary who sort of leads it. And arguably in cases where it's high risk, there needs to be that person because to sort of set the vision and set the tone. But in hindsight, people agreed, including the municipal entrepreneur, that you need to bring people on board. That's cross-party within your party, because there can also be internal party divisions that can sort of jeopardise the continuance of the project beyond the term of leadership, and getting trade unions on board as well. That means that if there are typical ups and downs that might, normally be expected, they can't be latched onto as a sign of incompetence or anything, and there can be sort of collective buy-in. One thing that one of the directors noted was that this presents a kind of a problem for governance, and currently in local government governance there isn't really anything that attaches a memo onto a high risk initiative and says, there is cross-party support for this. It will be continued in the next administration, especially where you might think that maybe you need to give 15 years to an energy project to start breaking even, and ensuring that buy-in over time seems important. Beyond that, it does seem that certain initiatives might require accelerated decision-making processes because of changing market conditions or just sectoral requirements, regulatory requirements, and having some way in which the council can respond or make decisions more quickly, and often this relates to financial officers as well. Again, this comes down to ensuring that certain governance procedures are in place for dealing with these kind of situations. And just to add again that we do see, of the range of ways that we've seen insourcing increase over the UK, we are seeing some councils, like as I said, so I kind of think Hackney's doing this too. They've been overhauling their procurement processes from the bottom up, and governance alongside that to favour insourcing, to build capacity, to build that resilience into it. We see others like Greater Manchester pursuing more of a social value model, and we see some ad hoc. So it does seem we can't really generalise about the way in which it's being done, but maybe that's a point of interest as well. So how are councils creatively or independently dealing with some of these issues? And that's something we don't really know yet, but would be an interesting thing to start to look into once these insourced contracts start to bed in a bit more.
Thanks, Beth, for your insight.